Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 122, Meno 89c to D. Meno had reverted to his original question. He wanted to know whether Socrates thought that virtue was teachable or came to people by nature or in some other way. He had forgotten his other option of being exercisable. And instead of objecting that they really should find out what virtue is first, Socrates accepted the request and suggested a hypothesis that if virtue is teachable, then virtue must be knowledge. After a long argument, which finally concluded that virtue could indeed be something teachable, Socrates gave a ridiculous argument in support by showing that virtue cannot be something which comes to people by nature. He proved this by showing that people who are born good would be kept locked up in the Acropolis until they're old enough to be useful to the city. And the fact is that babies are not locked up in the Acropolis. Since virtue doesn't come to people by nature, it must therefore be something which comes to people by learning, mathesis. There are several fallacies here, one being that even if Meno had given 4 options, it doesn't mean that if we eliminate 3 of them, the 4th option must be correct. But this is what Socrates does. Of course, there are only 3 options already because Meno has forgotten one, and they ignore the 4th option, which is some other way. So we're reduced to just virtue coming to people by nature, which has just been refuted by an absurd argument, and that was only in order to prop up the previous conclusion that virtue is something teachable. But now when Socrates says, and therefore it must be by learning, he has treated the ridiculous argument against by nature as if that requires the conclusion, yet again, that virtue is something teachable. Plato now has Meno complete the entire argument with something even more ridiculous. To ke moi ede anankaion enai, kai delon, O Socrates, kataten hypothesin, eper episteme estinarete, hoti didacton estin. This now seems to me necessary, and it's clear, Socrates, according to the hypothesis, if virtue is knowledge, that it is something teachable. The original hypothesis, which Socrates gave, was that if virtue is something teachable, then it must be episteme, knowledge. No hypothesis, even the reverse of the original hypothesis, should be used as a demonstration that the conclusion they've just reached is true. Furthermore, if virtue is something teachable, is it the same as saying that we acquire virtue by learning? We recall that Meno himself does think that whatever is taught is whatever is learnt. He is the one who replaced didacton with matheton in his original question at the very beginning of the dialogue. Something teachable, something learnable. They're the same thing for him. This is because Meno thinks that whatever a sophist tells him is what Meno himself should remember and regurgitate as if that is knowledge. Before we leave the subject of hypothesis, perhaps it's worth saying what hypothesis means in Greek. Thesis, in English thesis, is a putting, a positing. This is translated in Latin by positio, which in English becomes position. Hypo in hypothesis, hypo is under, a positing under everything that is built upon the positing. In Latin, the hypo part is sub, as in submarine, subway. Sub and positio, a positing under, exactly what hypothesis is, a suppositio becomes supposition in English. If there is a difference between hypothesis and supposition in English, it is that the hypothesis is a conscious supposition. While people may assume things in English, we can say they assume, they suppose, that may be unconscious, although it could also be conscious even in English. The main point I want to make here is that whatever one supposes at the beginning of an argument should not be in the final conclusion. There should be no supposition in the final conclusion, the way that Meno has placed hypothesis in his final conclusion. Basically, after all of the discussion that we have had ever since the original hypothesis of Socrates, we are no wiser than we were before, apart from the conclusion that was made and then somehow dropped, it simply disappeared, that phronesis is right usage. This once again emphasizes that virtue is about how and not what is done. For example, it really doesn't matter what a man does so long as he does what he does well. Another way of putting this is it doesn't matter who runs a polis. It doesn't have to be a man, it could be a woman or a slave or a boy, so long as he or she runs the polis well. I thought I'd summarize all this now because we are about to enter new territory and we're bound to forget all of this middle section of the dialogue. Meno is happy that Socrates has chosen that virtue is something teachable. This at least is what Meno thinks, and that is why Socrates has to burst his bubble. Issos ne dia, ala me tuto ukalos homologes amen? Perhaps by Zeus, but perhaps haven't we agreed to this not finally? In other words, Socrates is now suggesting that they have made a bad agreement, a bad conclusion, although it's not clear which conclusion he's referring to, his own or Meno's. Either way, we might suppose that he is wondering whether they were right to agree that virtue is something teachable. But we have to remember that that was the hypothesis. If virtue is teachable, or something teachable, then what must it be? It must be knowledge. This is what Socrates is about to question. Meno is not happy. Kaimen edokege artikalos legestai. But it seemed to be finely said just now. I'm saying finely in the sense of beautifully or well. What sounds correct usually is understood to be actually correct. Instead of pointing out this distinction, Socrates says that it should appear to be said finely all the time. Alla me uk ento artimonon de e autodoken kalos legestai. Alla kai ento nun, kai ento epeta, e melle ti autu hugies enai. But it shouldn't appear to be said finally just now only, but also now in the present and in the future. If any of it is going to be valid, Well, Socrates is partly right. A universal truth should be consistent, but its validity should be based on its content and not on its form. It would be too much to expect Meno to understand that, so Socrates doesn't even try. And now Meno does at least ask a proper question here. Tiunde, prostiblepon dus cheraines auto kai apistes me uk epistemee he arete. What then? Having looked at what, are you displeased with this and disbelieve that virtue is episteme, knowledge or understanding? Interestingly, Meno has assumed something that Socrates hadn't said. Socrates was simply casting doubt on their conclusion, whatever the conclusion might be, and Meno has decided that the problem that Socrates has is that virtue might not actually be episteme. This was not at all clear from anything that Socrates had said. Socrates goes along with this, and much of the rest of the dialogue will be to do with this very point, that perhaps virtue is not to do with episteme. Now, we don't know if Socrates himself would have gone this direction if it hadn't been for Meno's question. Socrates usually adapts his argument to whatever his interlocutor says. Obviously, this is the way Plato wanted the dialogue to go, because it is Plato writing the dialogue. But it's interesting that he had Meno cause this change of direction, not Socrates. Another small point worth noting is that Meno uses the expression to look at in deciding about something else. This is what Socrates usually says when he wants to talk about the idea of a particular type of thing, and you look at the idea to decide whether something conforms with that idea. For example, the idea of a chair. If something conforms with the idea of a chair, we may conclude that it is a chair. This isn't the case here. Meno has no idea about idea, although Socrates has used the word in this dialogue. The idea is simply the type of things. The type chair is in all chairs. This is not to be confused with the so-called theory of ideas, which is based on a superficial reading of things which people in the dialogues say, assuming that they say what Plato himself thinks. But we'll leave that and get back to our own dialogue next time.